getting us all here. Just to say, as we all have been doing already, a very warm welcome to everyone. Welcome to regulars, as it were, and a great welcome to those, if this is your first Disparate Romantics webinar. We're in for a treat tonight. We had a preparatory chat a couple of days ago, and the conversation was amazing. We couldn't get through the business for talking about the Quincy, so we know it's going to be a fascinating evening. And a very warm welcome to Professors Grevel Lindop and Professor David Ruderman. Good evening, gentlemen. This is what it's all about. I'm not sure how well this is going to show up on the camera, but this is the London magazine for 1821, and for the September edition, the September publication, was this essay called "Confessions of an English Opium-Eater," and I hope you can maybe just get a sense of what it looked like when it first appeared. So this was part one, and then followed by part two, I think a month later. And then there was a promised part three, which didn't appear. But parts one and two are pretty good. And so that's what we're here to talk about. The subject matter, its relevance today, but also how it came about. And in the course of this evening, we'll be looking at the manuscript. I think I'm right in saying, Grevel, that the largest surviving manuscript of the Quincy, which is part one of Confessions. So we'll be looking at that, if you like, through your interpretation of it. But then we'll also later on be looking at the relevance of de Quincy's work and issues of addiction today. And that's where David will particularly specialize. And do stay, not that you will go, but do stay towards the end, because the poems and the video that come towards the end are very special too. One of the poems has got the line, "Who is not addicted?" And that looks at the question of addiction beyond de Quincy, beyond opium, and the many ways in which it takes its form today. But before we go any further, please can I take the opportunity to ask Grevel and David to introduce themselves, if you would.
Okay, well, I'll start. I used to be a professor of English. I'm a freelance writer now, but I became interested in de Quincy very early on. I'm probably the only person in the world who didn't start reading de Quincy with the Confessions. I stumbled across his recollections of the lakes and the lake poets, and I was just blown away by the quality of the sharp observation, the wit, the eloquence, the wonderful description of character, and the mixture of profundity and humour which de Quincy managed. And so I went straight on from the lake poets to reading Confessions, and I was hooked from there on. I went on to edit an edition of the original text of Confessions as it appeared in the London magazine. Thanks to Jeff and his colleagues, we're actually lucky enough to have the original manuscript of part one here at the Wordsworth Trust, and we're going to have a look at the pages of de Quincy's handwriting shortly. Having got my fingers sticky by editing the Confessions, I then gradually got drawn further in. I wrote a biography of de Quincy, and ultimately I organised, with encouragement from the former boss of this institution, the Wordsworth Trust, with the encouragement of Robert Woolf, I organised a complete edition of de Quincy's works, complete with all the manuscripts. And so this ended up taking 14 years of my life and occupying 21 volumes. Others can judge whether it was time and paper well spent, but at least it was done. And it's on the shelf here at the Jerwood Centre at the Wordsworth Trust. So de Quincy rather took over my life for a good many years. So that's my story.
And this will be on many people's shelves. It's certainly on my bookshelf in my office. So thank you for that, Grevel. David.
Yeah, my name is David Ruderman. I'm an associate professor of English at Ohio State, Newark, here in the United States. And I'm a romanticist. I teach primarily romantic literature, and I focus mostly on poetry. So actually, my first introduction to De Quincey was reading a collection of his letters to Wordsworth. And so that was sort of my interest. And then I read the Confessions in grad school. It was on a reading list and I read it, and I loved it, but it didn't seem relevant to me because I was focused so much on poetry, and just really didn't think that much about De Quincey until about 3 years ago, when I was developing a class called Literatures of Addiction. And it was during that period when I really began to think about this as being one of the earliest accounts of addiction. And part of the idea of the class was to teach Literatures of Addiction, not as any kind of as a way to think about the way that addiction sort of intersects with everything and connects with everything, but also in a way to sort of destigmatize the idea of addiction, and to sort of, I don't know, to sort of think about it as core to all of our lives, not just something that happens to those people. So I got really interested in teaching it, and it's an amazing text. And but I don't claim to be a De Quincey expert by any means, but I'm very happy to be asked to do this. I also do more work with poetry and people that have been convicted of nonviolent drug offenses in here in Ohio. So they have the option, some of these folks, of either going to prison or jails, and some of them, if they're charges are just drug charges, even if or violations of parole, that sort of thing around drug charges, they have the possibility of doing a day program, so they don't go to jail or prisons, and they have it's a really, really progressive program. I hope we have more and more of them. Well, we are having more and more of them. There's a little pushback, but we're having more and more of them. And what happens is that they're able to take GED classes, all these different things, work on recovery from addiction. And then I started volunteering, bringing in a poetry writing workshop for people in addiction. And my reason for doing it was kind of twofold. One is that I was asked to do it. And secondly, I happen to be a person, recovering addict for many years, longer than most of the people in the program that I now deal with, but many years. And sort of the way that, at least the tradition of recovery from addiction that I come from, you never graduate, you never finish and get your PhD. You're always sort of an alcoholic and an addict. And so it's been a marvelous experience. It's one of my favorite things that I do every week. And while I don't necessarily teach De Quincey, I find the aspects of De Quincey coming up over and over again in my interactions with these folks. And so once I finish this book I'm working on now on lyric poetry, I hope to be able to work on the book on addiction and romanticism and the literatures of addiction. So I'm super happy to be here. Thank you for asking me, Jeff, and to be with Grevel. Thanks.
Welcome to you both. I guess I knew Grevel particularly when you were a trustee of the Wordsworth Trust, and I remember you telling me that you felt you'd sort of been appointed to fight De Quincey's corner in the Dove Cottage story, and you continue to do that. And it was a pleasure working with you on the Catherine Wordsworth Radio 4 program that you did a few years ago on Catherine's untimely death, too early death at the age of 3. That was a very moving program. And David, I'm very pleased that Julia's part of us tonight, because it was Julia that introduced you and I a few years ago, and I'm a very happy thing that she did. You might remember coming to England, and we did a weekend where we thought, how can we bring Wordsworth to people in different communities, the very work that you're talking about. And the idea was to create a pack in which people could work in residential homes or care homes or in different settings and have a quote from Wordsworth. And the reason I mentioned it, because David, it's finally been finished. And this is a surprise to you as well, because this is the pack that we've done. And inside this box, there are 13 illustrations by Cumbrian artist Alison Critchlow. And on the back of each is a Wordsworth quote, a thought, and then a creative activity that you might follow. So we'll send you one, of course.
Thank you so
We'll
much.
send you one, Grevel. And if anybody else who's part of this evening feels that that could be of use to them, a poetry kit inspired by William and Dorothy, and you could use it in that sort of setting, please just put your name in the chat and we'll send you one as well. It's part of funding that we've got, and we'd like to share them as widely as possible. I ought to have said too that we're going to have a break in about 8:15. So at that point, we'll bring the questions together for the second half. Now, we thought it might be nice, didn't we, to have a flavor of confessions. I mean, everybody perhaps being part of this will know the work, but we thought it would be good if Grevel and David perhaps read a favorite passage, as it were, and spoke to it as well. So, David, why don't you go first this time, if that's okay?
Yes, I'm afraid my choice is a bit predictable. It's the section called Pleasures of Opium. And narrative is really, really important. Of course, I think of, it's really interesting. I think about the genre of this text. I think about it as being, you know, of course, a memoir, a sort of Bildungsroman, but I also think of it really as lyric in a way. And by that, what I mean by that is that it sort of establishes a kind of fiction that allows for the kind of creation of a subjectivity, or the expression of a subjectivity, or the revelation of a subjectivity, of a sort of self, a sort of telling a confession, going back to, you know, Augustine and Rousseau, et cetera. So that's the way I think about this. And I tell the students this. And in the tradition of recovery that I'm in, the 12-step tradition, you know, they have these stories that we have something called the AA Big Book. And at the back, they have all these stories, and they're like confessions. And so I really think it's interesting that these kinds of descriptions. So that's why I came to this particular passage. So I'll go ahead and read it. I should say that preceding this in the book, he begins by telling us that, of course, he's going to be talking about opium, and he begins by sort of defending himself against a kind of attack of low moral character because he does opium. And Grevel has pointed out that, you know, he names a number of famous people that have in England that have done opium or do opium. And so my sort of coming to this is after this, he talks about his childhood, et cetera. This is when he really first talks about when he first uses it. And the pleasure-pain duo, sorry, it's my dog, of course. Yeah. The dog's name is Keats. So I guess on the mention of pleasure and pain, he went insane and had to bark. The pleasure-pain sort of aspect of this is largely how De Quincey frames his addiction. So I'll go ahead and read it. It is so long since I first took opium that if it had been a trifling incident in my life, I might have forgotten its date. But cardinal events are not to be forgotten. And from circumstances connected with it, I remembered that it must be referred to the autumn of 1804. During that season, I was in London, having come thither for the first time since my entrance at college. And my introduction to opium arose in the following way. From an early age, I had been accustomed to wash my head in cold water at least once a day, being suddenly seized with a toothache. I attributed it to some relaxation caused by an accidental intermission of that practice, jumped out of bed, plunged my head into a basin of cold water, and with hair thus wetted, went to sleep. The next morning, as I need hardly say, I awoke with excruciating rheumatic pains of the head and face, from which I had hardly any respite for about 20 days. On the 21st day, I think it was, and on a Sunday, I think it's amazing that he details it exactly to this point. I can detail my first drink to the exact moment, you know, where, I mean, really, it might not have even been my first drink, but in my memory, it was the first time I got loaded and felt that release and that amazing feeling. So he's got it the 21st day. On the 21st day, I think it was, and on a Sunday, that I went out into the streets, rather to run away, if possible, from my torments than without any distinct purpose. By accident, I met a college acquaintance who recommended opium. Opium, dread agent of unimaginable pleasure and pain. I have heard of it as I had of manna or ambrosia, but no further. How unmeaning a sound was it at that time? What solemn chords does it now strike upon my heart? What heart-quaking vibrations of sad and happy remembrances? Reverting for a moment to these, I feel a mystic importance attached to the minutest circumstances connected with the place and time, and the man, if man he was, that first laid me open to the paradise of opium eaters. It was a Sunday afternoon, wet and cheerless, and a duller spectacle this earth of ours had not shown than a rainy Sunday in London. My road homewards lay through the Oxford Street and near the, quote, stately Pantheon, as Wordsworth obligingly called it, I saw a druggist's shop. The druggist, unconscious minister of celestial pleasures, as if in sympathy with rainy Sunday, looked dull and stupid, just as any mortal druggist might be expected to look on a Sunday. And when I asked for the tincture of opium, he gave it to me as any other man might do. And furthermore, out of my shilling, returned me what seemed to be a real copper halfpence, taken out of a real wooden drawer. And I'm not going to keep going, I'll just stop there. But you see, this is the beginning, the very beginning. And he traces it back to this. And it's here that he begins to talk about the pleasure of opium. I've written about, in a book, in my one book called The Idea of Infancy in 19th Century British Poetry, I've written about Sarah Coleridge's struggle with the opium addiction. And she talks about the kind of ritual around it and the kind of attachment around it. And I think it's so beautifully written about here. I think it really forms an important aspect of the book for me and for my students. We really, really tend to key in on this first passage. So that's a little bit of the text. I hope that's helpful.
It's fascinating that the preciseness of the date, as you say, because that's an element of the passage you're going to read, Grevel, isn't it? That it's very fixed on that very particular moment.
It is, yes. The thing about De Quincey's Confessions is that he starts off by tantalizing you by raising the question of whether it's disreputable and disgusting to talk about your bad habits and your addiction. And, you know, is it justified to do this for the benefit of other people so that people will understand and avoid getting into the same trouble you've got into and so on? And then, like every good narrative writer, he leaves that hanging and he flashes back and he talks about his childhood to explain how he came to be an opium eater. And opium is hardly mentioned for the rest of the first part. The first part then goes off into autobiography. And what he describes really is a series of emotional traumas. His father died when he was 7 years old. His mother was, according to De Quincey, emotionally cold and withdrawn. She didn't kiss her children, she didn't embrace them. He turned for emotional support to his elder sister Elizabeth, and then his sister Elizabeth died, probably of meningitis, as we now know. His mother moves away, he's sent to one school after another. He ends up at Manchester Grammar School, which he absolutely hates. He wants to be allowed to leave and go to university, but he's not allowed to leave, so he runs away from home. He ends up living on the street in London. It's amazingly modern because he's 17 years old, he's living in the street, he's starving. He manages to find find refuge in the house of this crooked lawyer who owns this kind of semi-derelict house in London, where De Quincey sleeps at night, wrapped in pieces of carpet, along with a little girl who seems to be holding out in this house as well. All of this is justified by De Quincey as an explanation of why he kind of has some sort of internal physical complaint which forces him to take opium. But I think we also experience it as emotional deprivation, which has left him with this hunger for something that has to solve his pains. He, having run away from school, incidentally, De Quincey performed the almost unique feat of running away from both school and university, because he then ran away from Oxford halfway through his exams. He discovers opium by giving himself toothache by washing his head in cold water. But it's also a literary moment. You noticed, I mean, David highlighted quite aptly the fact that De Quincey locates his druggist who gives him his first dose of opium in terms of what Wordsworth calls the stately pantheon. But he also says, earth, this a more dreary spectacle than a rainy Sunday in London, this earth of ours has not to show. What's he referring to? He's bouncing it off Wordsworth's lines on Westminster Bridge. Earth hath not anything to show more fair.
Yes.
De Quincey is showing us the opposite aspect of that city. But there's more, because having bought his dose of opium, he tells us that when he tried to go back to the same shop and buy another dose, the shop wasn't there. It seemed to have disappeared. Where does that come from? Well, as he was writing the first draft of Confessions, De Quincey asked his publisher to send him a copy of Keats's poems. He's thinking of Keats's Lamia, where the house of Lamia disappears, so that people looking for it find it's not there in the street, it's gone. So we've got these multi-layered literary echoes and creations on top of the autobiography, but focusing in, the part that I really want to look at is the absolute, another aspect of De Quincey, which is the living, almost journalistic documentary faculty that he has. De Quincey is writing the first version of Confessions, we need to know, sitting in the back room of a London pub amidst all the noise and hubbub, because he can't stay in his London lodgings because he's being pursued for debt. The bailiffs are knocking on the door. He slips out. He writes it in the back room of a pub. And here we have the precise detail again. He's referring to the house where he and the little girl are holed up, wrapping themselves in old carpet against the cold in this semi-derelict house. He says, this house I have already described as a large one. It stands in a conspicuous situation and in a well-known part of London. Many of my readers will have passed it, I doubt not, within a few hours of reading this. So we're pulled right into the present moment here. For myself, I never fail to visit it when business draws me to London. About 10 o'clock this very night, August the 15th, 1821, being my birthday, I turned aside from my evening walk down Oxford Street purposely to take a glance at it. It is now occupied by a respectable family, and by the lights in the front drawing room, I observed a domestic party, assembled perhaps at tea, and apparently cheerful and gay. Marvellous contrast in my eyes to the darkness, cold, silence, and desolation of that same house 18 years ago, when its nightly occupants were one famishing scholar, that's himself, of course, and a neglected child. So we've got the the specifics piled on top of each other. Here I am, I'm writing this now. You may have passed this house within the last few hours if you live in London and you're reading the London Magazine. I'm writing this tonight on my birthday. I walked past it earlier this evening and this is what I saw. And here's the contrast. And that 18 years ago, that was me starving in that house. So it's just so alive. And as we'll see, here at the Jerwood Centre, we have that piece of paper on which we have De Quincey's handwriting as he puts the date today, being my birthday, August the 15th. It's right there. Wonderful.
And as you say, writing it in the pub, and we'll see the evidence of the stains on the paper when we come to look at it. We've touched on opium. How can we not touch on opium? But we should say, shouldn't we, something about how common it was, because De Quincey tells us it's all sections of society, it seems, yes, that are affected by it. But I just thought before you responded, just so that in case, not that we're recommending you try this at home, but the recipe for Lancaster Black Drop, for example, just in case, is you take of opium, 4 ounces. I mean, that sounds quite a lot, 4 ounces of opium. Juices of quinces of a juice, 4 pints. Digest 3 weeks. Then add saffron, 1 ounce. Cloves, nutmegs, and cinnamon in coarse powder, 1 ounce each. Continue the digestion a week longer, strain through flannel, and evaporate the strained liquor to the consistence of a syrup. So that's how the opium becomes the thing you drink. And De Quincey talks about that in Dove Cottage, doesn't he? Where he has the tea, but he also has the vessel with the opium in it. But I wonder if you could say something about how common it was. And do we talk about an addiction, or do we talk about a habit of opium at this point?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting that I've come across, both in working on Erasmus Darwin and then later working on Sarah Coleridge, is that let's say you had a problem, some sort of problem, and opium was then prescribed for you. If you came back with talking about the side effects of the opium, more opium was prescribed to deal with the side effects. So it was quite interesting to see that you don't really rest well when you're taking opium. You don't really sleep. You sort of just kind of dream sleep and whatever. And it absolutely seemed that there was a kind of, I mean, it reminds me of our recent situation here in the United States with opioids. And you know, you're having a pain, we'll give you some pain meds. You're having problems getting off those. Maybe you're not on the right pain meds. We'll give you more pain meds. And then if you become addicted, then we're cutting you off. But it's okay because you can get other meds, you know. So it just seems to me that it's a public health issue, but it's connected to a much larger societal sort of situation. In terms of your question about like habituation versus addiction, I don't have a firm feeling about that. I've always figured that people can decide for themselves whether something is becoming a huge problem for them.
I think maybe I was thinking there about the medical interpretation of it.
The medical interpretation. Well, the medical interpretation has to do with, if you could stop doing this right now, how is your health going to be? Are you going to be at risk? Or are you going to have withdrawal symptoms, et cetera? That seems to be the medical sort of thing. If you can stop and just have psychological cravings and whatever, then you're not, quote, addicted. I think they say you have, what is it? I can't even recall what it is, but you have something else. You have a compulsion, not a compulsion. I don't remember what it's called, but it's different. Oh, somebody is good. I hope somebody has good advice here. Yeah, between drug tolerance and addiction, right? So that there are different sort of categories. But I think with De Quincey, he calls himself an addict. You know, so Grevel, I'm sorry, I sort of went on a bit.
Not at all. I'm just checking, but no, I'm not muted. I have a working definition of a 19th century writer who is an opium addict. My working definition is that to identify a 19th century writer who's an opium addict, is it any 19th century writer of whom a detailed biography has been written? When we look into it, every 19th century writer regularly took opium in one form or another. I can ask those participating in this seminar, do you take paracetamol? Do you take ibuprofen? If you do, in 1840, you would have taken opium. If you had to take it regularly for a bad back or sleeplessness, you would have become tolerant, if not addicted. It was everywhere, and it was the painkiller of the day. I don't know whether it's meaningful to apply our definition of addiction. De Quincy makes it into a drama because he has great psychological and philosophical interests, and because it seems to have had very strong effects on his inner life. But in a way, he created this model of addiction, which was then taken on by other people. But how far we can use that, I don't know.
It's striking to me, though, Grevel, and I wonder what you have to say about this, that I don't remember the exact space, but it's someplace in Pleasures of Opium, or maybe it's in the first section, where he says, before I ever took opium, I loved to drink wine. I just love to drink wine. And he makes a real point of this. And we know this about Coleridge as well, that Coleridge was a really, really heavy drinker before he ever took opium. So it makes me think that there's a predisposition towards something in these kinds of situations. I think that's right. And De Quincy does see this partly in terms of an emotional void or an emotional problem. He says at one point that he has to take opium because he is too much of a eudaimonist. He hankers too much after the state of happiness for himself and for others. It's just too difficult for him to put up with harsh, painful conditions if he doesn't have to. And the opium is one of the answers to that. And he does. I think it's at the point where he joins his friend at Eton, and he hasn't eaten for a long time. And he's offered some alcohol, and he says that he has always loved alcohol. Are you muted, Jeff?
Sorry. So we'll take a break shortly, but just to lead us up to that break, and when we come back, we'll look at the manuscript. So we'll have a 5-minute break very shortly. But Grevel, I wonder if you could do your trustee bit and stick up for De Quincy at Dove Cottage, as it were, right at the corner. Could you tell us a little, please, just about the link between Dove Cottage, Wordsworth, and De Quincy that sort of will nicely lead us up to 1821 when we come back?
In terms of pop psychology, which may or may not be right, you could say that De Quincy had been looking for a father figure for a long time, his father having died very, very early in his life. After he had run away from school and lived in poverty on the streets of London, he rejoined his mother. And was then, typically of his mother, she didn't keep him with her. She sent him off to a cottage in Liverpool for some reason. While he was there, he had already, I think, read the lyrical ballads and fallen in love with Wordsworth's poetry. And so he wrote this wonderful fan letter to Wordsworth, telling him that the discovery of your poetry was an epoch in my life. It's transformed my way of thinking. You're a great man, and you know, I would love to meet you. He was 17 at the time. Now, Wordsworth very generously offered this completely unknown young man, this total stranger, an invitation to come and visit. But De Quincy was too scared to do so. He was overawed. And several times he went up to the Lake District over the next 3 or 4 years. He went to stay at Coniston. He climbed up Red Bank on the other side of Grasmere Lake. He looked looked down at Dove Cottage, and then his nerve failed him, and he didn't dare to walk down into the valley and go and introduce himself, and he fled back. He did this 2 or 3 times. Finally, he managed to find a way in because he got to know Coleridge, and Coleridge invited De Quincey to go with Mrs. Coleridge up to the lakes, and they stopped off at Wordsworth's cottage, and De Quincey was able at that point to go up the path at Dove Cottage, meet Wordsworth. He was invited in, he was invited to stay, and he spent several days staying with the Wordsworths. And from then on, he was a friend of the family. He never got as close to Wordsworth as he wanted to. He was a great favourite with little Catherine Wordsworth, the youngest daughter of the family. He was quite a close friend of Dorothy Wordsworth. In fact, mutual friends at one stage thought there was something romantic beginning between them. But he never quite became as much of a buddy of the poet as he wanted to be. He was always slightly treated as a hanger-on, as being a slightly marginal member of the group by Wordsworth himself. And so, while he never ceased to admire Wordsworth's poetry and indeed to describe him as the greatest poet of the age, he also cherished a slight resentment, a bit of an animus, a sense that Wordsworth was a bit arrogant, a bit standoffish. And I think it was this combination of adulation and a tinge of bitterness that makes his biographical portrait of Wordsworth so marvellous, because he's fascinated by this man, he's full of admiration, and yet he sees all the man's irritating little faults and blind spots. And so what you get in De Quincey's recollections of the late poets is a wonderfully living portrait of the poet. It's the first really credible biographical portrait of Wordsworth, and indeed of Coleridge. And when it was published in the 1830s, people were absolutely horrified because they thought this is a violation of the hospitality of these people. But now we would not wish to be without those portraits, because they absolutely bring those great poets to life in a way that a more detached view might not. So, as always with De Quincey, the situation is full of ambiguities and tensions, but wonderfully alive because of them.
But it did mean, didn't it, that he would be one of the few people who heard the prelude in say, the 1810s. And it did mean, too, of course, that he was then able to take over Dove Cottage and have it for whatever it was, till 1835. So the link between the two, including the damage he did to the garden, which probably didn't help his relationship with Dorothy.
Well, we can argue about that. I mean, you're saying damage. We'll have that out some other time. But the really astonishing thing, which I think students of Wordsworth's poetry or the textual scholars have not looked at properly, is the fact that on his first night staying at Dove Cottage, De Quincey was sent to bed with a copy of the prelude, a manuscript copy, which he read.
Yeah.
And we don't know which text that was, but it seems to me the question is worth asking. And I don't think anyone's ever really gone into this and tried to assess the evidence.
And then the link, as it if there is a link, but compare and contrast the prelude and confessions is maybe the subject for another question.
There is certainly a connection. Incidentally, just as a final bombshell, which many people I think are not aware of, late in life, in the 1850s, De Quincey told the visiting American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, according to Emerson's journal, that he had lost his copy of Wordsworth's autobiographical poem. So it may be that De Quincey lost a manuscript of the prelude. Maybe it's still around in an attic in Edinburgh or somewhere, unnoticed. Who knows?
Well, my memory may fail me here, and there'll be plenty of people in the audience who can put it right. But I have a feeling that there is another version of the 1805 prelude that was copied. I think it was almost called the old copy of the prelude that Dorothy copied from. And I don't know that I know that existence. I'm not suggesting for a moment that's it, but
Could
that
be.
would be tantalizing, wouldn't it? That would be really interesting. Yeah. Shall we take a break at that point, just for 5 minutes, and then when we come back, we'll look at the manuscript. I will just say, people are dropping emails into the chat. If you would like a box, this set, we're very happy to send you a set like this one to use in your activities. I guess all we'd really ask is please would you use it if we sent it to you? We're happy to send it, but it would be lovely if it was used. It's very decorative, but it's there for a purpose. So thank you. So shall we reconvene at 20 past and we'll look at the manuscript when we do. Okay, thank you. I'm expecting Hannah to make a brief reappearance. I'm not sure whether she will. Hello, Hannah.
I'm still here. Yes, anybody that would like a poetry kit, feel free to send me an email using, I'm taking note of your names as well, but if you'd prefer to send me an email, I've just put my email address in the chat, or just reply to your email from Eventbrite and I'll pick it up and I'll follow these up next week.
Put an address, please, if you could put a written.
So just send me an email with that information in and I'll pick it up as soon as I can.
Thanks,
during this break, I might as well take the opportunity to highlight some forthcoming online events from the programme. So on the, let me check my list. So some of you, I do recognise some people may have attended our ongoing contemporary poetry series, which is taking place online this year. And it's called Go to the Poets, They Will Speak to Thee. Each event is themed around a different aspect of Wordsworth's writing, and we build off that to invite a contemporary poet who we think speaks to that theme. So our October Go to the Poets, They Will Speak to Thee event is with the fantastic Roy McFarlane, who is the former Birmingham Poet Laureate. He will be answering a line from Wordsworth's preface to the Lyrical Ballads, in which Wordsworth argues that the poet is the rock of defence of human nature, an upholder and preserver, carrying everywhere with him relationship and love. So we felt that Roy was the perfect poet to step into this place, and he balances between lyricism and telling a story, and he asks really difficult questions about power. He often uses the rhythm of jazz in his work to create poems that feel almost like physical objects that you can hold. So if that sounds interesting, I'll pop the link in the chat. If you do subscribe to our newsletter or subscribe to our Eventbrite, we always send notifications about all of these different events and when we put them online. We also have a special free event coming up at the end of October. As you may know, this year is Dorothy Wordsworth's 250th birthday, and our new exhibition celebrating Dorothy Wordsworth opens at the end of next month. So to celebrate that exhibition on the 27th of October, we have a free online event that invites the contributors to the exhibition to come and talk about their work. So that includes Jo Taylor from the University of Manchester. It includes author Kathleen Winter, artists Alex Jacob Whitworth and Lee Hassel. It also includes an independent researcher called Samantha Frank, who's been looking at the response from ROA's communities to Dorothy Wordsworth. So I'll also pop that in the chat. So that's absolutely free, and it's going to be a fantastic event. The final event I will mention before we get back to Quincy is yet another special online event, which is on the 9th of November. We invited the Poet Laureate Simon Armitage to come and perform in our museum earlier this month. So we recorded this performance with a small audience, and we'll be broadcasting it on the 9th of November online. So please do check this out. Harriet, our Dorothy Wordsworth exhibition opens on the 23rd, Saturday the 23rd of October. So we'll begin posting about this on social media soon and add a page to the website. The Dorothy Wordsworth exhibition will run from the end of October all the way through to the end of next summer. So there's plenty of time to come and see it and some really fantastic contributions. So please do come along to our free online event, which we will also record and put on our YouTube channel with interviews with the people who contributed. So it's going to be a really fantastic evening. think we're nearly ready to start again. As I mentioned at the beginning of the break, if you would like a poetry kit, just send an email to me directly or reply to the email on Eventbrite, and I will be in touch next week to sort it out with you. But now I think we're all back, so I will hand you back over to our speakers.
Brilliant, Hannah, thank you so much. We got a quick question, which I think could almost do with could get a one sentence reply. And that was, I think was opium expensive? Can we give a quick answer to that one? Shake of the head from 2, that suggests it wasn't expensive.
You could get it for a few pence.
That's a good answer. Now we're moving to the moment where we can see the manuscript. So Grevel, can we hand over to you, please, to kind of talk us through 1821 and with the manuscript to hand, please.
So I hope the focus is good enough. This is the manuscript. It's bound, as you see. It was bought by a collector late in the 19th century and bound. This is the actual sheets which were fair copied and further corrected by de Quincy, sitting in the back room of the London Tavern. We have at the top Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, being an extract from the life of a scholar. And then he started off writing to the editor of the London Magazine. And then he's decided to make it more personal. So he's crossed out editor of the London Magazine and he's changed it to the reader. I here present you, courteous reader, with the record of a remarkable period in my life. Considering, according to my application of it, crosses out a few words, I trust that it will prove not merely an interesting record, but in a considerable degree useful and instructive. In that hope it is that I have drawn it up, and so on. So de Quincy was writing the article from his notes, which he had compiled probably a few months previously, with the intention of writing an article for another magazine. The deal had fallen through, and he went to London, wrote it for London Magazine instead. But he was working under considerable pressure, and he didn't have time to make a proper fair copy, and that's why we have all these corrections. The printers were waiting for the material, and de Quincy sent the article into the London Magazine in a few batches of a few pages at a time. Now, one of the fascinating things that came to light when we were able to see the original manuscript, I should say that the manuscript was bought by the Wordsworth Trust after having been in a bank vault, because it had been purchased as an investment by the British Rail Pension Fund, and it was locked up in the bank vault for many years. Then it came on the market, the Wordsworth Trust bought it. And one of the things which de Quincy did was to adopt some shock tactics by not actually naming famous addicts, but indicating with initials who they were, so that the reader would be able to identify these people. Now, in the manuscript, he says, some years ago, I computed at that time the number of those in one small class of English society, the class of men distinguished for talents or of eminent station, who were known to me directly or indirectly as opium eaters. And then he goes on to identify them, such as, for instance, the eloquent and benevolent W, and there's a dash, the late Dean of C, and there's a dash, Lord E, Mr. C, the philosopher, a late Under Secretary of State, Mr. C.L.L., and many others hardly less known, whom it would be tedious to mention. Now, it's quite easy with even a superficial knowledge of who was who at the time to identify these people. The eloquent and benevolent W is Wilberforce, the anti-slavery campaigner. The late Dean of C is the Dean of Carlisle. Lord E is Lord Eldon, the Lord Chancellor of England, in fact. Mr. C, the philosopher, is Coleridge, and so on. Now, when the London Magazine came to publish this, they didn't want these people to be identified, so they took the initials out and they just put dashes. And it wasn't until we got our hands on this manuscript that we could find out who De Quincey had been talking about. But it's fascinating that even just identifying these people by initials was considered as too scandalous. It was somehow perhaps felt to undermine their moral standing. But De Quincey is very clear that it's not only these eminent deans and philosophers and politicians who can be regular users of opium, because he goes on to say that I happened lately to be purchasing small quantities of opium from a London druggist, and he says the druggist assured me that there were so many amateur opium eaters, as I may term them, who needed to purchase opium, that the druggists had difficulty distinguishing regular users from people who were perhaps planning to take their own lives. And then he goes on to add that in Manchester, he's been told by manufacturers that the cotton workers in the cotton mills are very widely also addicted to opium. In other words, what De Quincey is saying is that opium is present at all levels of society. There are people dependent on it, from the highest in the land to the average worker in a cotton factory. It's everywhere, but nobody wants to talk about it. And so he is going to talk about it. If you're wondering about the stains, you can see these wonderful brown stains. If you ever see a De Quincey manuscript coming up in an auction catalogue, you can bet that you will be told it has opium stains. People want to believe that the stains are opium. Jeff tells me that these stains were in fact analysed at Porton Down, the government's chemical defence, if that's the word, institution, and they were found to be coffee. So we know that De Quincey was writing in the coffee room of an inn. Somebody, De Quincey or somebody else, spilt their coffee over it, and there are the stains to prove it. I'll just show you a couple of other details. This is the page where De Quincey, no, we're going the wrong way, I'll go the other way. De Quincey talks about passing the house in Greek Street on his birthday. Can we get into focus? Yeah, there we are. Yeah, this house I have already described as a large one. It stands in a conspicuous situation and in a well-known part of London. Many of my readers will have passed it, I doubt not, within a few hours of reading this. For myself, I never fail to visit it when business draws me to London. About 10 o'clock this very night, August 15th, 1821, being my birthday, I turned aside from my evening walk down Oxford Street to take a glance at it. So there we have the date, August 15th, 1821. There's the ink in which De Quincey writes the date on that very night. And we know that this is not made up, this is accurate. It fits, the chronology fits all the evidence. He was writing this on his birthday. I will show you one further detail. It's interesting that De Quincey was working against the deadline for this issue of the magazine. and you can see the manuscript is quite a mess hereabouts. He was sending his copy in to the printer in installments, 3 or 4 pages at a time. He's numbering the pages. I don't know if you can see, but yeah, I've got various Zoom bits of information on the top of my screen. You may just be able to see the numbers 37 and 38 at the top of the pages. Yeah. At a certain point, having sent off a batch of pages, De Quincey couldn't remember whether couldn't remember what number he got up to, and so the next batch is numbered alphabetically. We've got D, E, F, and so on. He'd simply forgotten where he got up to. It gives a very strong impression of the hasty, hand-to-mouth, anxious way in which this masterpiece was written. I mean, you have this wonderful prose style, and yet here he is crossing passages out, spilling coffee on it, sending a parcel of pages off, and then forgetting where he got up to and starting again. It seems chaotic, and yet there was an aspect of De Quincey's mind which was just so systematic, so thorough, so perfectionist. When De Quincey revised an article, if it hadn't yet been published, he would frequently begin at the beginning and write a completely different article. He could just keep turning a subject around and producing new things. He was an amazing improviser, and yet each version would come out perfectly polished. And so, written under the most impossible circumstances, in a state of chaos, you have this wonderful lyrical prose which can't be improved on. And here are the pages to prove it. That's probably enough.
No, there can never be enough of this. It's absolutely fascinating. And it reminded me a bit of Dorothy's journal, where the manuscript of, where when he mentioned that precise moment, he goes back afterwards, doesn't he? And he adds the time on the line above. That he's got to get the final detail. He goes back and adds that. If there was time, I would tell the story of the Porton Down moment when this young curator had to take this manuscript into the top security place. And I was told the only way, I bet everybody's heard this story before, but I was told that the only way they could test whether it was coffee or opium was to trickle water over the pages. And I had do I lose my career by watching the ink just wash off these pages in this test? Well, they used a very, very, in case Michael's watching, they used a very small amount of water. And of course, it proved that it was coffee, which was a great disappointment. But it was a very, unforgettable moment to do that. You have with you, don't you, Grevel, as well, the first edition. I wonder if you could just quickly sort of just show us the title page of the first edition, if you would, please.
Yeah, it's here. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. It's anonymous. There's no author's name on it. 1822, so the book was published the year after the articles appeared in the London magazine. They were published by the same printers, the same publishers who put out the London magazine, because the article had been such a sensation that they cashed in and they produced it as a book. What it does have, which the magazine version didn't have, is an appendix where De Quincey goes into the question of whether or not he has actually given up opium. He's very ambiguous about this. In the manuscript, he tries to give the impression in the magazine version that he's given opium up, but in the appendix to the book version, he admits that he hasn't, and it's curiously complicated. You can see him going round in circles about whether he has stopped taking opium or whether he hasn't. He says those who have read the confessions will have closed them with the impression that I had wholly renounced the use of opium. I don't know if I can get this in focus for you. I probably can't. No, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this. Okay, so he says, I gave the impression that I had wholly renounced it. This impression I meant to convey for two reasons. Well, first, he says, because the very act of deliberately recording such a state of suffering presumes in the recorder the power of surveying his own case as a cool spectator. In other words, he says, I had to pretend I'd given it up because I needed to sound objective. You wouldn't have believed me if you'd thought I was still addicted. But I mean, that's slightly bizarre. But then he goes on to say, well, I also gave the impression of having given it up because I really intended to give it up. I really was going to. So in a way, it was sort of true. And then he says, well, in fact, I am going to give it up. It's right at the top of my to-do list. Just as soon as I can get the peace of mind and clarity to concentrate on making the effort, I'm really going to do it. But I haven't actually had the opportunity to do so yet. But I've really tried. And then he follows it up with this enormous, I'll see if I can focus this again, this enormous table of figures. He gives a massive table of figures showing how many drops of opium he's been taking. There's a lot of small print where De Quincey lists dates and dates and dates, how many drops, how many drops, how many drops. July the 1st, 80 drops, July the 2nd, 80 drops, July the 3rd, 90 drops. It's a huge apparatus, but when you kind of dig through it all, you realise at the end of it that he hasn't given it up at all. He's going around in circles, demonstrating how sincerely he means to stop, but he never stops. And this process will effectively go on throughout his entire life. I'll just add one little footnote. While we're on this subject of dependency, there is a model for the title which De Quincey chose. I mean, really, he was the person who popularised the phrase "confessions of a." There have been hundreds of books with that title. Where did De Quincey get it from? He got it from Charles Lamb. Charles Lamb had written an essay called "Confessions of a Drunkard," under a fictional persona, talking about his own alcoholism. So we have another kind of dependence acting as the model, in a way, for what De Quincey did. I mean, De Quincey does it much better, but his title came from Charles Lamb, Confessions of a Drunkard. So it's alcohol first, then it goes on to opium, and so on.
I'd like to just to sort of move on to David talking about modern world a little bit, but we've just got a quick question, which I think I know the answer to, but someone's saying how many books were published in the first edition, and did De Quincey make any money from it? So my guess would be 1,000 copies and £20 from the book, but can you improve upon that, Grevel?
I don't think we know how many copies there were. There's no record. How much he was paid, I'm not sure whether we have any documentation on that. Now, if anybody knows, it's probably Rob Morrison.
I think I read somewhere that he did get £20, but
Rob might know. It may be that I've forgotten, or it may be that I didn't know. If Rob is there, Rob might know. Perhaps he can tell us via chat or Q&A or something. Do you know Rob? Is Rob there?
Well, in the introduction to Rob's latest edition of Confessions, sorry, Rob, just in case you're not able to join it, it does say that De Quincey got £20 for the book.
Okay.
So that answers part of the question.
In 1822, that's a good fee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
let's look at the impact. We talked about the impact in the 1820s, but thinking of time passing, it would be just very interesting, David, if we could move on to your work today.
Sure.
You mentioned that you don't necessarily use confessions in your work, but that it's very much in the background of it, if not directly. So could I hand over the floor to you, maybe for 10 minutes or more, just to sort of...
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Grevel, for walking us through the manuscript. That was lovely. That was really beautiful. And I think, you know, when you were talking about the kind of back and forth that Quincy does in the appendix, you know, that I'm trying to stop, I did stop, or I thought I would not be believed if I said I didn't stop. This is a constant sort of backdrop to the kind of internal psychological state of being addicted, is this kind of constant situation. And I will tell you something that happened to me day before yesterday. I was with some people that do organizing, political organizing around addiction here in Ohio. And we were handing out Narcan. If you don't know what Narcan is a drug that will revive someone who has overdosed. So basically we try to get it into the hands of as many people because there's an absolute epidemic of opioids, heroin, and now meth that is laced with fentanyl. So people are dying left and right. And so we're handing out Narcan. And someone came up to the table, a young woman with her mom, and said, and, you know, we're just out there in the public square giving it away, you know, and this comes up with her mom, and the woman says, "Oh, I've been clean 8 days. I don't need any Narcan." Now, from my point of view, it's like, no, you should take it. You know, you should have it because you right now you intend to stay clean, but 8 days is nothing. You know, it's not a long time to stay clean. So it was just that mindset that tells us. I went through this myself for years before I stopped. Every day I was going to stop, and every day I couldn't stop. And so this mindset is really beautiful to have in this form. And I think that because of what you said, Grevel, in the future, I will teach the appendix as well, because I think that's really, really key. And I appreciate that. So yeah, getting on to the work that I do with the people that are in the day reporting program. So they come into the program at all different levels. Some people have you know, had some college, other people have dropped out of high school. They come at all different levels. I don't worry about that. I just open a space for them to write poetry. And I don't tell them it has to rhyme. I don't tell them it has to make any sense to anybody else. I give them small little books for poetry, hardbound books blank books they can write in. I give them pens. And at the end, when they graduate the program, they get a book of poems that they can then take with them. And I've had people tell me that that they still write in that same book, and that it started a process of self-reflection and poetic, you know, sort of practice for them. So I think of it, and because I'm not like the teacher in this setting, instead I'm just another person who's trying to stay clean one day at a time. I sort of think of it as spiritual practice as opposed to like teaching. But they do learn things. I say, oh, that's alliteration. Look what you're doing here. You're doing this. And of course, because they're embedded in a culture in which they listen to music, they've heard poems, they know jingles, you know, whatever, they already have a sense of rhythm and language. They have a sense of being able to line out a poem. And I will sometimes make small corrections. So I thought I would share a couple of the poems that they've written. One of them was written last week or 2 weeks ago for an event that I did. And it was written by a young woman. I don't think she'd mind me saying her first name. Her name is Kyra, and she's been clean a couple years. And she was in my program a couple years ago when she was just getting clean. So can we show Hannah the one called I Know? No, not that one. Yeah, I know now. I now know. Okay. So again, Kyra is someone who never wrote poetry before, but she continues to write in her journal. So this is what she wrote for an event we did last week, about a month ago, maybe. I now know. I now know peace. My soul no longer foreign to quiet or stillness, nor do I fear the unknown, my mind neither scattered nor racing, not terrified of the not so fleeting thought that I won't get my next fix. I have broken from the shackles that held me bound and impended to a certain death. The sun has shone through the hell cloud, my darkest secrets. I have a purpose. I have a reason. I am light. I am love, resilience, the embodiment of energy. I no longer fear the light because I finally know who I am. So I think this is just beautiful. I was very proud of her to have written this, and it was really wonderful to experience it. But I guess what I want to say is, like, I don't make great claims for these as the best poems ever written in the English language. I think they are statements, almost collective statements of a people trying to break out of the sort of position of addiction. And it's not a treatment. I don't think of it as a treatment, but a sort of supplement to that treatment. So can we look at present day? No, I'll do that one in a second, Hannah, do present day. Thank you. This was written by somebody, Julie. I see Julie asking about the slashes and the line breaks. Well, I show them poems, Julia, that use those forward slashes, and I use them in some of my poems. So I think they're copying from the things that they've been presented, right? So they learn some of those things. In terms of line breaks, sometimes I'll talk to them about line breaks, but very often they feel when the line break should happen. And sometimes it's an enjammed line, sometimes it isn't. But it's a great question. I think the person, it could be, I'm not exactly sure where they get them, but it might be from Ocean Vrong. I often use some of his poems for them to learn, and he uses a lot of slashes. So this one is written a couple years ago. It's called Present Day. And I will tell you, a twack star, I didn't know what it was either. A twack star is a meth addict, somebody who's tweaking. You know, crystal meth is a form of intense amphetamine, and it just sort of, according to the people that do it and talk to me about it, it's like nothing else, and it's very, very, very addictive and very hard to break the cycle. So this was written from a young man in the program. Present day. The sun shines hot on a humid, sticky, cloudy afternoon. I'm on my back porch swing, smoking a cig, relaxing, but sweaty twack stars fighting like rabid cats over the last hit of their dose. Long hours later, temperatures rise, 85 Fahrenheit. Man, why's it gotta be so humid? Thoughts interpreted, Twackstar is asking for some cold water, which I give him and send him away, left with thoughts of empathy, glad for my sobriety. Sorry, I'm a little bit parched there. So this was written by one of the people in the program. I want to say just about the time I started with this program. And I keep track of some folks, but I don't know where this young guy is. So the last thing I'll read you, and Hannah, I don't think we have time for the video poem, so maybe you could put it in the chat. That way people can hear the voices of people who'd actually been involved, and people can go to YouTube and listen to it, because I don't want to take up more time with that. So this is part of a poem that I wrote. And the reason I chose to read this to you guys is because in thinking about this book, you know, Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, sorry, Grevel, I don't have your edition. I already apologized about that. I'm also thinking about this book by David Ricardo. So those of you who don't know David Ricardo was a political economist, along with Adam Smith, I think, largely responsible for starting to theorize and think about the way capitalism worked and how, and both of those writers were very important for Karl Marx later. And then, of course, De Quincey becomes a political economist later in his life. And in the Confessions of the English Opium-Eater, at one point in The Pains of Opium, he says that I've only been able to read one book, and it was this book by David Ricardo, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And so in my mind, these things are interwoven, the kind of way in which, well, I'll just read the segment and maybe you'll get the idea of what I'm trying to say. It's part of a longer poem called Addiction Under Quarantine. So this is section 4. And I call this section The Conquering Road. Mass incarceration, healthcare for profit, broken families, violence, poverty, isolation, alienation, dysfunction on demand. Who is not addicted? Flows of capital, flows of pain, fentanyl shipped through the mail, Amazon, internet porn. Who does not want to change the way they feel? 200 years ago, Thomas de Quincey ate opium for a toothache. Flows of pleasure, flows of pain, delirium tremens, hallucination, paranoia, craving, trauma, abuse, capitalism, liver damage, amnesia on demand. So I'm asking you sincerely, who is not addicted? Lowered fuel emission standards while the planet chokes on carbon. If you breathe, you are addicted. If you pay taxes, if you drive a car, just living in this system makes you sick. Brain damage, diabetes, overdose, genetics, anxiety, depression, fetal alcohol syndrome. And who is not affected? My niece, who died from sharing needles the same year I got clean. My half-brother, who drank himself to death the same year my daughter was born. And no one in the family knew for 10 long years. My confession and my defense are the same. I have every disease inside of me. I have committed every crime. I was named for a mythical king on the conquering road. So, so to kind of put just a cap on this, you know, in my neck of the woods here, we have a number of it's not only addiction, which is an epidemic. Systemic poverty is an epidemic. I teach in a Rust Belt town that used to be steady middle-class jobs, and now people generation to generation are lucky just to work, you know, at Wendy's, McDonald's, these kinds of jobs. And in fact, you know, COVID, because of the, whatever you want to call it, the sort of universal income of those checks that our presidents, the great President Trump sent out, actually helped people out of poverty in a way that they hadn't been for a while. They were able to actually get by. So I see these as really interconnected. And so it's not just those people's problem over there, it's our problem too. And it's wonderful to connect it also, you know, back to, you know, that's my vertical access to talk about temporality, not just spatiality, but back to the 200 years ago, and Thomas de Quincey writing about this and highlighting class and poverty so much in the Confessions. It becomes an important sort of, as Grevel pointed out to us, the kind of trauma that he writes about in section 1 that in some ways doesn't determine or make him an addict, but certainly sets up conditions that make that perhaps more likely in any case. And that's all I have on that. So thank you so much. And if you want to know more about the program that I'm doing or any of the programs we do here in Ohio, please just email me, and you can find me through Ohio State.
That's something, David. That's really quite something. At our meeting on Tuesday, you sent some notes through of your initial responses to our topics, and I would I would like your permission, as it were, to read a section from them, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Because this is what you say, to be a little more explicit or blunt. It's that paragraph, if you don't mind. For me, we are addicted to a system of organizing society in a way that resembles drug or alcohol or gambling addiction. We know that we should change the system, that we should organize our lives around people rather than profit, around longer-term pleasures rather than the short-term pleasures associated with capitalism. And yet we continue on, we rationalize. De Quincy, who was not a political radical, at least I don't think so, still makes these connections. And Grevel, you said something similar, that addiction was absolutely part of a capitalist world in which we live. And I don't know whether either of you would like to just add 30 seconds to that, but it seems a very powerful place to finish.
I think so much of what we're used to in the present state of the world depends on addiction. And De Quincy is able to confess to that. He's able to show it as terrifying. He's also able to show it as in a way absurd and comic. And he doesn't try to iron everything out into one kind of argument. The great thing is that he shares his experience. He offers it in terms of images, which we can explore in so many ways. He allows us to love him or to criticize him. Everything hangs around this wonderful phrase at the center of the Confessions: nothing human is alien to me.
Yes. No, I agree, Grevel. That's very, I always point that out to my students. Yes.
Sorry, if you just allow me to interrupt, I think someone might have a YouTube video running in their browser. I don't know. Jeff, is that you?
It's not me. No, I'm not.
Me either. I just checked.
Oh, well, never mind. Carry on.
I guess I just wanted to sort of like return to the images that De Quincy gives us, whether the images of the young girl who he lives with in the abandoned house, or whether they're the images of Anne. They're very powerful images, and we didn't get a chance to talk about the Malay, but I just feel like all of these images kind of constitute this world that De Quincy is showing us. And I think there are innumerable similarities between our world and that world.
Well, I don't know what that noise is, but it's not happening here. I think we should stop there because I think that's the perfect place to stop. Many of you will have seen Rob answering the question that there were 3 editions, each 1,000 volumes per edition. And as well as the biography by Grevel, of course, Rob Morrison's biography, the 2 of them together, great works. I feel that tonight, to me anyway, to my mind, we've had the 3 wonderful things. There's been this exchange between you 2, Grevel and David, about 2 people who know this subject intimately, who kind of live and breathe the subject, great knowers of the subject, and who I kind of feel have listened and have learned from each other as well. And that's always a privilege to, if you like, almost eavesdrop on. And so for your conversation, for your own humanity, for your insights, thank you both. I think the second great takeaway for me will be there's nothing quite like hearing someone talking through a manuscript who knows the manuscript. And to be guided through it, Grevel, again, by a man who knows the right thing and who knows the manuscript and knows what it tells us, that's captivating too. That was really special. And then thirdly, David, you talking about your work, you talk about De Quincy and the word humanity, that comes through and through. And you say it might not be a treatment, but by God, keep doing it. It's good and it's doing people good. And that line, which is what I no longer fear the light. I mean, that's a kind of wonderful thing in writing. And so it seems that we sometimes talk, don't we? What's the what is the relevance of romanticism? We don't even need to ask that question because it's alive. It speaks to us today as it spoke 200 years ago. The costumes are different, the clothes are different, but it's humanity, and it touches all aspects of humanity. And you've brought that out for us tonight. And I feel kind of moved. I feel like I've been through something this evening, listening to you both. And on behalf of the many people listening, can I thank you both sincerely? And absolutely, I can't thank you both very, very much. And thank you everyone for sticking with it. Well, why wouldn't you stick with it? Thank you for being part of it. And I hope you can join us again, everyone, for at least, I know the next one in this series is the Dorothy Wordsworth, which will be sometime towards the end of October. So thank you both again, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Come on, David.